He received his BA in political science summa cum laude at the University of Pittsburgh and his PhD in government from the University of Texas, Austin. Marc is the author and co-author of several articles and books, the most recent of which, Prius or Pickup. And I will shamelessly plug this for you because I wanted to buy this book. It is on back order at Flyleaf, but it is going to be available the end of this month. So he's promised to sign mine. So this is how the answers to 4 simple questions explain America's Great Divide. His particular interest right now that he's working on, as I understand it, please correct me, Marc, if I'm wrong, is trying to understand how this great partisan divide affected our response as a nation to this horrible pandemic that we have experienced. So thank you for being with us tonight.
Oh, thank you so much, Pat and Krishna and everybody for being here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that my survey team here at Carolina and I have done on the pandemic. But one of the things that I thought would be interesting just to, and I'll share my screen in a moment. I have some slides that I think you guys will both, find interesting and a little bit fun at times. But one of the things that ended up in the last paragraph of a paper that we just submitted for publication, I think is a pretty useful one for us to think about as we consider the end game, well, what's hopefully the end game of the pandemic. It read like this: even when they take a dreadful human toll, national tragedies can lead a nation to rediscover its shared identity, shared values, and shared sense of purpose. So it was with the Great Depression, Pearl Harbor, and the terrorist attacks of September 11th. So it might have been with COVID-19. In another version of history, one can imagine face masks and vaccine cards becoming the modern day analogs to victory gardens and American flag lapel pins. Instead, the nation remains mired in disputes over matters of ground truth, not to mention the legitimacy of its political leadership. It's a testament that much has changed and that an acute threat to democratic accountability remains. And this is the thing that has really vexed me and concerned me of late. We just don't even seem to come together when the chips are down, when times are tough. And I think the work that my co-author Jonathan Weiler and I did in Prius or Pickup in our previous book as well gives us a sense of why that might be. It also gives us a sense of why it's going to be really difficult to overcome, and maybe some clues about ways that we might be able to nudge people together when need be. So with that preface in mind, let me share my screen, and we'll see how that goes. And again, there's just this notion, that exists. My parents were longtime political hands actually in Harrisburg, and there's just this notion like, well, why can't we overcome this polarization? We always used to be able to overcome our party differences. And, it's that political education that I got from them in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s that, fuels my interest in research in this question. So with that in mind, I'm going to show you some pictures that, are not going to be of any surprise to you. This was going back to late 2021. And what we have here is the degree to which states have high levels of vaccination in their states. And of course, the blue states tend to have higher levels of vaccination, that is fewer people who are fully vaccinated. The Vermonts and the Marylands and the New Yorks are, of course, on the left side, they voted more for Biden. And of course, the West Virginians and Wyomings are the reverse. So, again, what we see here is that we didn't come together as it relates to the pandemic, at least not as far as vaccination rates were concerned. And again, one thing I want you to file away in the back of your mind, and I'm going to come back to, is Donald Trump vaccinated? Yeah, didn't he play an extraordinarily important role in bringing the vaccinations to the table earlier than most places? And the answer is yes to both of those things. So, we're really grievously divided, in this sense. Of course, it's not just states, it's actually people. This is from the Kaiser Family Foundation, which tracks a lot of really interesting data. And what they tracked from the time when vaccinations were widely available starting in April of 2021 up through October, and they've continued to do this, they track the percentage of people in different partisan groups who say that they are unvaccinated. And what you see here is at the beginning, there were very few differences between Republicans and Democrats in terms of vaccine uptake in April. But of course, the thing that most people had in common as part of those early vaccinations was that they were older. And that was what was encouraging people to get vaccinations. What we see is a opening up of vaccine differences that take place, such that by the 10th month of, so 6 months later, 60% of those who remained unvaccinated were Republicans, only 17% were Democrats. And, again, this has, not to minimize, I mean, this has life and death difference. It makes life and death difference in the United States. So this is from the New York Times, and, what it tracks is the average daily COVID deaths in the United States by whether the county where the deaths occurred had large Trump vote shares or large Biden vote shares. And of course, what we see in the counties with larger Trump vote shares is 3 times the death rate in those counties. So in a sense, one's party identification is lethal, in this particular case. How can this possibly be? The thing that's even more, and this is something that, I've been doing some work with the people at Pfizer and Moderna, trying to figure out a little bit more. We've done some survey work that shows that this hesitation about vaccines as it relates to Republicans versus Democrats these days actually is now carrying over into vaccines of all sorts of other kinds. So before the COVID-19 pandemic, there were no differences between Republicans and Democrats in terms of whether they got the seasonal flu vaccine. But our survey work in March of this year shows that about 70% of Democrats got the report having got the flu vaccine, whereas fewer than 60% of Republicans reported having got the flu vaccine. We asked whether people agreed that it was important for children to get recommended vaccines. Both sides overwhelmingly think it's a good idea, but now there's a 15 percentage point difference between Democrats and Republicans. And of course, as you all know, in all likelihood, getting childhood vaccines is really important in order to eradicate the types of diseases that childhood vaccines are meant to do. So it's critical that these bars are up near 100%, for them to have the desired effect. And there's a question about adult vaccines. Should we get new vaccines for adult illnesses, or do you get adult vaccines for new illnesses as soon as they become available? So like the shingles and pneumonia vaccines, Democrats are again about 15 percentage points more likely to say that they do that, whereas Republicans are less likely to. So again, remember, there was no difference between Republicans and Democrats before COVID. On just general attitudes about vaccination, and now they have opened up. Now, we were interested a little bit in some solutions. I have at the top here, if politics is the problem, it also, I should have put provides the antidote. So one of the things that I'm going to show you real quickly is something that we did as a research group at North Carolina. We created a public service announcement. I'm going to show you it and get your take on it. And the idea is this: if partisanship caused the divide between Republicans and Democrats about vaccination, can we use partisanship to shrink the divide? So one of the things that most people in America did not know necessarily, at least not with certainty, was that Donald Trump himself was vaccinated. So what happens if we share this bit of video with them?
Donald Trump is urging all Americans to receive the COVID-19 vaccine.
I would recommend it, and I would recommend it to a lot of people that don't want to get it, and a lot of those people voted for me, frankly.
Both Trump and former First Lady Melania Trump did receive their vaccines privately in January at the White House.
So this is one of the most exciting things I've ever been involved with. Political scientists actually made a difference in something. What we did with that ad, we won a big grant, and were able to run a randomized trial on YouTube where we showed that PSA, public service announcement, in over 1,000 low vaccinated counties across the US, and we didn't show it to the same number of counties that were similar in every way to those counties that we showed it. And then we ran the public service announcement, spent about $100,000 on YouTube. And in the counties where we showed it, the average county saw an increase of 103 more vaccinations compared with similar counties that didn't receive it. So we conclude from our PSA campaign that we increased, with just $100,000, vaccinations by, we estimate, 104,000. So we spent about 90 cents, per dollar to get people to, take up the vaccination. And, this is an example of kind of leaning in to the differences that exist in the country. We know that they have politics at their core, so we're going to lean into that fact, and we're going to try to do away with those differences by, using political cues. And you can imagine, if a non-Republican, a Joe Biden or Anthony Fauci was the person who was the spokesperson in these ads, they would have probably boomeranged as it relates to Republican audiences. And in fact, we found in our survey research before we ran the ads that unvaccinated Republicans identified Donald Trump as the person who they trusted most to provide them information about the COVID-19 vaccine, even 20 percentage points higher than their family doctor. So what we have here is a very effective spokesperson under those circumstances. So this is one example of trying to work across, try to bring the country together, in ways and using partisanship. It's not the only way. Another PSA campaign that we undertook, maybe you all may have seen on WRAL. We were able to work out an arrangement with the people at WRAL where they put together or helped us record a PSA with a source Q, a source who we figured Republicans might respect and really like. In this case, it was General Hugh Shelton, a former head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So let me show you the ad that we put together with General Shelton, retired General Shelton, and see what you think. This was about trying to get Republicans to wear masks.
Served my country for many years. This is a crisis unlike any that I have seen. In the span of a few short months, America has had more deaths than in the entire 38 years that I served on active duty. Now it's time to turn the tide, to fight it. Wear a mask. It works, and it will save lives. I wear a mask to protect you. You wear a mask to protect me. We wear a mask to protect our great nation. God bless America.
All right, so let me see. I gotta figure out where I am here. All right, I'm back. Oh, I gotta share my screen again. No, I'm sharing my screen. Okay, I gotta go back to this again.
You're not sharing your screen, by the way.
Oh no! Did you not see General Shelton?
No, we heard him.
Okay, let me show you General Shelton again. I am so sorry about that. Oh dear. But my competence level is suspect. Just ask my kids. Okay.
I
Here we
think
go
they
again.
need
Here's
to
General
Served my
Shelton. You may
country
have
for
seen
many
this.
years. This is a crisis unlike any that I have seen. In the span of a few short months, America has had more deaths than in the entire 38 years that I served on active duty. Now it's time to turn the tide, to fight it. Wear a mask. It works, and it will save lives. I wear a mask to protect you. You wear a mask to protect me. We wear a mask to protect our great nation. God bless America.
All right. How did I do there? Did it work that time?
Nope.
What?
Okay, try it again.
Okay, one last try.
So let me see.
Share screen. Desktop.
It's okay. There.
There you go.
Oh my goodness. All right. So here we go. One last try for General. Did you see President Trump though?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay. One more try. There we go. Here's General
I
Shelton.
served my country for many years. This is a crisis unlike any that I have seen. In the span of a few short months, America has had more deaths than in the entire 38 years that I served on active duty. Now it's time to turn the tide, to fight it. Wear a mask. It works, and it will save lives. I wear a mask to protect you. You wear a mask to protect me. We wear a mask to protect our great nation. God bless America.
All right. So at long last, but again, the idea is the same. We have these divisions, and what's going to be really important to do if we're going to overcome those divisions is to meet people where they are. And what we found in our survey work is that Republicans were not wearing masks at anywhere near the same rate that Democrats were. So how do you get people who are not wearing masks to wear masks? And we found that the group in society that Republicans like and respect better than any other is the US military. So we found a spokesperson from the US military to provide a pro-mask message. And it worked. When we did our survey work, we ran this in the WRAL viewing area, and we did some follow-up survey research and found that among people who saw our ad, among Republicans who saw our ad, their attitudes toward masking improved by about 10% relative to people who hadn't seen our ad. So, if we're looking for solutions, they're hard, but they involve meeting people where they are. Okay, so anyway, why is it that way in America these days? How can partisanship be so powerful today that it literally has life and death consequences? And what I argue, and what the argument made throughout the book that Jonathan and I did, is that it's the nature of what divides Republicans and Democrats that leads to misunderstanding and hatred. So I want to illustrate this with, of all things, a poem. There's a poem. It's based on one of Aesop's fables that Donald Trump used to use on the stump when he was campaigning in 2016, and continued to use with audiences in his time as president. CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Committee in particular, was a place where he showed it. And I'm from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, a little outside of it. And I came across this when he was doing a rally in Harrisburg. And one of the things that he does it in the context of is immigration and allowing refugees into the country in the United States. And of course, he thinks this is a bad idea. And he thinks that liberals are quite naive in thinking that it's a good idea. And to illustrate that point, he uses this poem by Oscar Brown Jr. And he gives it, his audiences go crazy for it. He will tease it like a professional wrestler might tease something, putting his hand up to his ear. He really wants to, do you want me to read the poem? And they do, and such. And so it goes like this. On her way to work one morning, down the path alongside the lake, a tender-hearted woman saw a poor half-frozen snake. His pretty colored skin had been all frosted with the dew. Oh, well, she cried, I'll take you in and I'll take care of you. Now, of course, the snake, instead of saying thanks, delivers a fatal bite. The woman is about to die, and she cries out, I saved you, cried that woman, and you've bit me even. Why? You know your bite is poisonous, and now I'm going to die. Oh, shut up, silly woman, said the reptile with a grin. You knew damn well I was a snake before you took me in. Okay, so this is a fable, and you can take a lot of different things away from it. And the point is this: people who are on the political left and people on the political right read this poem in completely different ways, completely antithetical ways. Is the, to people on the political right, the people who are cheering Donald Trump in his rally, this metaphor is a clarion call to common sense. Immigrants and refugees might harm us, and it's not worth the risk. People on the left see it completely differently. They see it as a disgusting incitement of prejudice. Immigrants and refugees are people, they're not snakes. And you can see how the solution for one side of the political debate creates the problem for the other. If you're on the political right, the solution is to keep immigrants and refugees out. That creates a problem for those on the left. If you're on the left, you want to invite immigrants and refugees into the country. And for people on the right, that's like dumping a basket full of snakes on the ground of your living room, okay? So in that sense, we understand the same situation in completely different ways. And you can apply this difference in understanding across so many different issues and such. So how did we get here? How did we get organized such that Republicans and Democrats view this story in such different ways? I submit to you that 40 or 50 years ago, 30 years ago, Republicans and Democrats were constituted as parties in ways different, such that they wouldn't understand that this metaphor differently. So when I grew up, when my dad was central to politics in Pennsylvania, what we had was what we called the New Deal party divide that divided Republicans from Democrats. And it was based on differences in opinion about free enterprise versus government regulation, business versus labor. Should we have more government programs and spending, or should we have fewer? The basic size of government is the government necessary to make fairer the economic marketplace and so forth. All right. Now, this is difficult stuff. Most of us are not experts about what government does. So we experience this in our heads. Over the last 30 years or so, 40 years, these New Deal party divide issues have replaced the New Deal. And these issues now that divide Republicans from Democrats are race, gender equality, law and order, opinions about sexual orientation, immigration, terrorism. We can talk more about those later. But the key thing that I want you to keep in mind is, take race and gender equality, for instance. If we went back to the 1960s and even into the 1970s and 80s, those issues divided both parties, Republicans and Democrats, internally. They didn't agree on those types of issues. They didn't agree on Vietnam internally. Now they divide one party from the other. Okay. Now, parties, of course, are coalitions of groups, and based on these worldview type issues, what I call worldview issues, they've divided Republicans and Democrats up in kind of unique, in a different way than we used to be. So it used to be that whites and non-whites, they didn't necessarily used to be on different teams, different parties back in the day. Now they are. Men and women were not, on different teams back in the day. Now they are. Religious people and secular people didn't used to be on different party teams back in the day. Now they are. I mean, think about the 1970s. Was anybody secular? I mean, did that word even exist? I mean, there were, now they call people who are secular, they call them nuns, N-O-N-E-S. When I was a kid, nuns, they were N-U-Ns, they were a habit, and so forth. I reveal my Catholicism. Place, country versus city. These are all things that divide us. And I think what they boil down to is Republicans, now are about their traditional. They're not about small government. They're about preserving the traditional versus Democrats about pushing the novel. And here's the thing that's wild. The fact that this is now our dividing line now creates some very strange divides in the electorate. All right, so we have Republicans and Democrats again. And this is, part of what Prius or Pickup is about, is it identifies that we don't agree about anything, not just politics. Republicans and Democrats differ in their tastes about food. Republicans tend to like American food. Democrats are more into ethnic cuisine. They drink different kinds of beers. Republicans favor the light macro beers, whereas Democrats favor the dark micro beers. So, if you were having this happy hour at a bar, I'm going to tell you, we could find out a lot about party identification just by looking at the beer in front of the person who is drinking it. Books, Republicans are more inclined towards nonfiction, Democrats towards fiction. Vehicles, big American cars for Republicans, small foreign cars for Democrats on average. So in other words, traditional choices versus novel choices. All right. Now, just to illustrate this in kind of a fun way, this is the Electoral College Map from 2020. The Democrats did well in the Northeast, the upper Midwest, the West, and Republicans dominated in the South and the Great Plains. All right, so keep that picture in your mind. This is the cat state versus dog state map. These are the places where cats are more numerous than dogs. Oh, how about that? It's where the Republicans, tend to lose. And this is where dogs are more numerous than cats. So it's the place where Republicans win. Now, I'm going to reveal my political affiliation, or at least give you a real suggestion of it, but I think it helps reveal the worldview divide. Now, I taught for 15 years at Vanderbilt, which is in Tennessee, and now I live in North Carolina, and this is dog country, right? And I have a dog, so I got to have a dog, but this is my dog. It's hardly a dog. This is our dog, Riley. You can see in a lot of ways that this is not your traditional type of dog. He has no discipline at all, obedience out the window. He's on the furniture. He weighs about 20 or 25 pounds. He's adorable and such. He is an equal with my wife and me in the household. Just to give you a sense of it, the year before COVID, this was our Halloween outfit. Riley does not really like the UPS man all that much. He, really wants to protect the house. Every time a UPS man goes by, he barks and barks and barks. So I got him a UPS thing, and also, of course, I dressed up in a similar costume. But I think this drives home the role that Riley plays in our household. Now, I have a really close friend. He's on the other side of the worldview divide. His name is Randy Zabel. We went to graduate school together. This is his dog. His dog's a wolf. His dog is, he would eat my dog. His dog is outside. It's going to keep the household safe. Is Riley going to keep anybody safe? No. But he's going to look real cute, doing it. But Randy, his actual nickname for his dog is the Beast. So again, it's a different understanding, it's a different mindset, it's a different worldview, that we have about things. And so again, as it relates to the Prius versus Pickup, it's not really the decisions that we make, it's the things that we associate with them. So the conservative blogger, Dan Pera, this is the way he described the Prius. He said, we all know it's the car of choice of liberals everywhere. They're as much a political statement as anything. By driving one of these cars, these folks are saying, I care more about everything than you, and you hate the environment and support torture. We're making judgments about people based on things that have nothing to do with politics. And I think it's part of what's driving us apart. If you got on a bus and were a Democrat, would you sit next to somebody wearing a Duck Dynasty t-shirt? Probably not. If you were a Republican, would you sit next to a professorial looking person wearing a tweed coat? No chance. And if we don't have those types of interactions with each other, then we never come to understand each other, understand that we're not actually bad people. We just have some differences of opinion. So if we're looking for the worldview that I think is central to what divides, the left from the right, this conservative versus liberal worldview, it's how threatening the world seems. But it's a specific kind of threatening in my view. So back in 2016, a survey organization asked the following question: which comes closer to your view? It doesn't have to be exactly right, but which one's closer? One of those views is our lives are threatened by terrorists, criminals, and immigrants, and our priority should be to protect ourselves. The other choice is it's a big, beautiful world, mostly full of good people. We must find a way to embrace each other and not allow ourselves to become isolated. Okay, so you can choose either one. Which one, is more like you? Well, as you can see, among those who chose embracing each other, almost 80% of them voted for Hillary Clinton, only about 15% voted for Donald Trump. And among those who say we ought to protect ourselves, about 75% have voted for Trump and about 15% voted for Clinton. And then we have some not sures over here. In the vernacular of social science, this is a strong relationship. This threatened worldview is something that tells us a lot about what makes people tick politically. Now, there's a question about threatened by whom or what. It's not that liberals and that liberals are not threatened. It's just who they're threatened or what they're threatened by. Conservatives seem to be threatened by things that are personifiable, that are people, criminals, terrorists, and immigrants. Remember, those are terrorists, criminals, and immigrants. Those are the things that we have in the survey question. What if you replaced criminals, terrorists, and immigrants with things like viruses, climate change, and words? Or Wall Street bankers or the banking system? Well, then liberals would be, feeling more concerned and threatened, right? So, again, I think this even points up the differences even further, though. Whom or what is threatening is a danger is different between people who are on the left and people who are on the right. Now, we have to find a way to measure these things in political science. And I'm going to close with a couple of things that involve those 4 questions that Pat made reference to. So I want you to think about how fundamental these differences are in Republicans and Democrats, because it's the answer to these 4 questions that reveal, in a sense, the Great Divide. And it's about qualities, desirable qualities in children. Which qualities in children would you rather have? So we ask a survey question every, so often, and it starts like this: although there are a number of qualities that people feel that children should have, every person thinks that some are more important than others. I'm going to read you pairs of desirable qualities. Please tell me which one you think is more important for a child to have. Now, I'm a dad. I have 2 kids. And of course, my answer to this question, these 4 questions, is all 8, but it depends, which one is most important. So people are read a pair: independence or respect for elders. Independence or respect for elders. You have to choose. You want them both. You especially want them when your parents are around to respect their elders. But maybe when they're at school, you want them to be independent. Curiosity or good manners. Same kind of thing, mom and dad are there. I want those good manners. But when they're exploring the world, I want curiosity. But here's the thing: they make you choose one or the other. And what we build is a scale of how fixed or fluid, and to use fixed is conservative, fluid is liberal, to build a scale of how conservative or liberal people's worldviews are. Okay. So if you answered independence, curiosity, self-reliance, and being considerate, you're the most fluid, the most liberal. And if you answered respect for elders, good manners, obedience, and being well-behaved, you're the most conservative, the most fixed. Now, let me pause here for a minute. Is there anything wrong with favoring kids who are respectful and have good manners and such? No, there's nothing wrong with that. Is there anything wrong with being, wanting kids who are independent or self-reliant? No, it's just a different way of seeing the world. Okay, it's totally legit, either way or the other. Okay, so I want to make that clear. All right, and here's the payoff from all this. back in 1992, when George Bush ran against Bill Clinton and Ross Perot for the presidency, the answers to those 4 questions, 1992, told us nothing about whether that person was a Democrat, an independent, or a Republican. If their worldview was more fluid or fixed, it didn't matter. They were basically equally likely to choose to be a Democrat. And if they were fixed or fluid in their worldview, they were about equally likely to choose being a Republican. However, by 2020, these differences are huge. Among people with fluid worldviews, 70% said they were Democrats, only 20% said they were Republicans. Among those who have fixed conservative worldviews, 70% of them say they're Republicans, and less than 20% say they're Democrats. Now, let me ask you this: do these questions, do they mention liberal or conservative? No. Do they mention Republican or Democrat? No. And yet they're nearly perfectly now sorted into the Republican and the Democratic Party. And I think that is the source of our divide, our differences. They're fundamental. What's important? Independence and creativity, or respect and obedience? That's what it comes down to. Now, it turns out that those people's opinions about child rearing have a lot to do with all of these different views about politics. Are you more or less of a fan of military intervention? How fixed or fluid your worldview is explains that. How are your racial attitudes? How fixed or fluid you are, how conservative your worldview is correlated with that. Same with immigration, gender equality, gun control. All of the big hot button issues are in large measure explained by the answers to these 4 questions, okay? So as these issues have become more important, this worldview has become more and more centered to politics. And not only that, not only do we all disagree about all of these issues, those on the other side of the divide politically, they drink the wrong beer, they watch the wrong television shows, and they drive the wrong kind of car. We don't agree about anything. As a result, the other party is no longer just seen as being disagreeable, but they're dangerous. Majorities of Republicans and Democrats now report that the other party makes them feel afraid, angry, and frustrated. And in fact, majorities think the other party's policies are so misguided that they threaten the nation's very well-being. All right, so we're not on the same page. Can we escape this worldview politics? I think it's unlikely in the short term. And one thing I want you all to realize is that polarization has historically been more the rule than the exception in the United States. Usually we've been polarized. It's just that the era that many of us grew up in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, that was the period that was weird and anomalous. More of our political history is more divided than that. And party leaders also have little incentive to change their approach with the 2 sides kind of tied. And I can get into talking about that a little bit more in the question and answer. Now, change is possible, though. And the way that these really divisive periods in American history have tended to change is that one party that's taken one side of these issues for a long period of time, they start to lose. And they start to lose by bigger and bigger margins. And they start to realize, we got to change our approach to politics. And then sometimes a new generation of leaders come along and they take us in a different direction as well. All right, so with that in mind, I'm going to stop so that there's still plenty of time to answer some questions, and we'll take it from there.
One question that I had, Mark, is when you were doing some of the research, I'd like to know how what variables you controlled for when you were choosing the counties that you worked with, and you said they were pretty well matched for the different variables that you had, but I was wondering what those variables were.
Okay, that's a really good thing. So what you have in mind here, Pat, is that study that we did on the Trump PSA study. So what we did was we took all of the counties in the country, so every single one of them, and we had data back from the CDC, which told us which counties had high levels of vaccination rates and low levels of vaccination, okay? And we focused on counties where vaccination rates were relatively low. I can't remember what the cutoff was, but with that left, and then there were some places where the CDC didn't have good data, like Texas, for some reason, they don't. So we didn't do this in Texas, but we took those relatively low vaccination counties, and we, and there were about 2,000 of them at that point. And we just chose at random, balancing on the population size of the county and what were some of the other considerations. But the key thing for me, or for us in our study, is because we balanced on population and because the choices were made at random between who got the treatment and who didn't get the treatment, that allows us to compare what the vaccination rates, the change in the vaccination rates that took place after the intervention took place, after the ad showed. And it's interesting that we found some interesting things, Pat. One thing that I think you'll especially find interesting is our ad had the biggest impact in counties that were more closely balanced between Republicans and Democrats than ones that were overwhelmingly Republican. And what that I think points up is that it's not just the ad that's doing the work, it's the ad interacting with the social circumstances that people live in. So if you live in a place that's overwhelmingly Republican, you probably don't know very many people who are getting vaccinated, or at least they're not sharing it. But if you live in a place that's a little bit more balanced by partisanship, there are plenty of people in your social circle who have gotten vaccinated. And maybe you don't feel quite as much of an outlier, in going to do it.
Thank you. We have a question from Vicky Boyer. Back in the 80s, I read that diverse people stay together as long as they have a common enemy. I was reminded of that during the 90s when the USSR collapsed. Could this play a role?
Yeah, Vicky, I think that there is definitely something to this. I can't show it with data, but you think about this period, this anomalous period in our history where we were not polarized. We had, so starting with the New Deal, we had, in a sense, a common enemy, which was the Depression. And then that was followed by the Germans and the Japanese. And that was followed by the Soviet Union and the Cold War. And, things started to, kind of pull apart at that point. I will say, though, I think it's a little bit more complicated than, just the common enemy notion, though. So think about the things that I identified as the polarizing issues that are so divisive these days. Well, they include racial politics, women, gender roles, and then later on, sexual orientation, immigration, and things along those lines. Well, those issues all started to become important even during the time that the Soviet Union was still an active force, okay? And, we often lament polarization as being something that's terrible and unmanageable. But one of the reasons we have the polarization is because we extended rights to all sorts of groups that had been discriminated against and unpopular. So, polarization might be a pain in the neck, but would African Americans want to go back to the 1940s? Would women want to go back to the 1940s? Would LGBT people want to go back to the 1940s? Well, maybe we had less polarization, but those lives were very different and much less good, back in that time. So, I think the rise of those issues is really important. The parties taking opposite positions on all those issues is really important. But the polarization itself is probably, well, probably, you know, a good thing in certain ways too. Okay, it looks like there are some other questions over here. Should I just take them on, Pat, or do you want to read them?
Well, I'm not seeing all of them. I'm seeing some comments from Ann to everyone. For me, the new Republican leaders are taking us in a very scary direction. More and more fringe candidates are being elected. Very troubling trend. I think this is an example of taking some of those differences and the being afraid of the other all of the time and really politicizing those things and really making us afraid of each other, which is very, oh, I'm sorry, I don't mean to take over this, but I just had a comment, very reminiscent. I had a few years ago read the book about Wilmington, and again, you have some of the same things playing out among the people in Wilmington who were so frightened by the rise of people who of color who had votes, the Black people in Wilmington. And, you know, this is so sadly to see this here, but yes, there are just fringes who take this even further and make it scarier.
Well, and this is one of the things that I think is going to be very interesting to monitor in the time ahead. So it is the case that, you know, and I don't want to engage in a lot of both sidesism here, but there is one just fact, and that is that both parties, at least on average, are nominating candidates that are more extreme than the candidates that they used to nominate, okay? Now, there's an asymmetry to that. The Republicans are going further to the right than Democrats are to the left, all right? That's a fact. But here's the thing that I find interesting. Will it matter when it comes to the voting booth? So I'm going to ask you guys a trivia question. So what president do you think had the fewest, the lowest percentage of defections from his party when running for re-election? You know, so Donald Trump ran for re-election, Barack Obama, George W. Bush, Ronald Reagan in 1984. So according to exit polls, which candidate got the highest degree of loyalty from his party? And I'm sure, you know, like the answer that I would have guessed is, well, Ronald Reagan in 1984, it was Morning in America. I mean, of course, or it could be Obama. You know, he had tremendous loyalty. You know who the answer is? It's Donald Trump. And, you know, that's remarkable for any number of reasons, but the most central of them is that it really flies in the face of about 70 years of political science research. And part of that is that leaders usually get punished, even when the circumstances are not their fault. You know, I think it would be, you know, you can certainly blame Trump, as many have, for, you know, the handling of COVID-19, but you can't blame him for COVID-19. But it doesn't matter. 200,000 people died on his watch, and the economy was a shambles and stuff like that. And yet 94% of Republicans still backed him. Now compare that with when other incumbents have lost. You know, George W. Bush or George H.W. Bush, he lost, you know, something like, you know, 25% of Republicans, and Jimmy Carter lost like 30% of Democrats. This points up that Republicans will vote for almost anybody who has the Republican label. Democrats, they hated Hillary Clinton, you know, I mean, as a political force, she was the least popular candidate, you know, who had ever run for president. And yet, you know, 95%, 90, 93, 94% still voted for her. Democrats will vote for anybody with a D next to their name now. So the question is, you know, these very extreme candidates, who's going to stop them, you know, from being elected? And it gets much more difficult, you know, to imagine containing that extremism.
Your commitment on the phone. Thank you.
Okay, so you know, I agree. This notion of you know, fringe candidates being elected is so somebody who's kind of fringy winning in the primaries, it makes a big deal. Now, here's the thing, though. Let's take Pennsylvania. So, the Republicans have nominated a guy, who showed up at the January 6th, Stop the Steal rally and, denies the election and, just gave a speech that included a white supremacist group and a QAnon group and stuff like that. Can that candidate win in Pennsylvania? That's a swing state. I don't think so. If the Republicans in North Carolina had nominated that candidate, here, could that candidate win statewide? I don't think so. So, there are some places, unfortunately, it's a relatively small handful of places that will, I think, punish that kind of extremism, but it's not a lot of places.
Vicky has asked also, historically, is there evidence of civilizations that have overcome this kind of divide?
Well, Vicky, the answer is yes. And in fact, we've done it. You remember, we've had a civil war, we had Reconstruction. We've had, conspiracy theories over, our history, it used to be the Masons, and then it was the Catholics, and then it was the, whatever, you'll fill in your group, that would, now it's QAnon, we've overcome these things. So I don't want you to lose faith, but boy, I feel like we have a really big challenge, on our hands right now. Technology is part of it. When I was growing up, when you all were mostly growing up, you didn't get a chance to choose your facts, in the same way that you get a chance to do now. That's quite different. But there were still, commentators who were out there, the Father Coughlins and so forth, who, were, providing people the opportunity to continue to believe what they wanted to believe, so, this is a natural set of forces, that take place in the world. We're just having a really hard time containing them right now.
Well, we have another question about the various minorities gaining power and causing this divide, possibly.
Well, Brenda, this is something that has really been getting a lot of attention, especially, lately. So, of course, America is changing, it's changing in all sorts of different ways. It's changing in terms of its religious orientations, and the country, as I was talking about, is getting much more secular. Young people are especially, secular these days. And of course, the racial profile of the country is changing a lot, in the course of the next 20 or so years, will be to a spot where whites no longer make up a numerical majority of American citizens. The combination of other minority groups will, nudge across, 50%. And I do think that this is, something that is, we'd like to think that it's not, but I think there's no question that this is an active concern, at least among, some people. But let's think about, how this plays out then in terms of, one side and the other. What it does is it escalates hostilities across, the divide. One side is, really concerned about the change in the nature and the culture and the religious, the cultural, the racial, makeup of the country. And they express those concerns. But what about the people who are on the other side? There's a group, that's out there that's embracing those concerns, embracing those changes. Their worldviews are different. They're celebrating the increase in diversity. And you can imagine the folks who are concerned about increasing diversity, they can't possibly imagine how there are people out there who are celebrating this. And then, of course, the people who are celebrating it can't imagine. I mean, aren't you got to be some kind of a racist not to embrace this. And so again, we're at this place where we just don't understand how the other side could possibly see the world that way.
We're seeing polarization in other countries. We have, a group meeting from the United States, meeting in Hungary, which is being held up as some big example. What accounts for polarization currently being seen in other countries?
Yeah. I am not as much of a expert on comparative political science, but what I will say is that the research that I have done suggests that the nature of the polarization, at least in certain places, is very much the same as it is here, the nature of it. So let's think about, instead of Hungary, there's a lot of, there's stuff going on there that is different from, what we're talking about elsewhere. But let's think about what happened in Britain with Brexit, what we just saw in France with Marie Le Pen making the finals of the presidential election. She's the very far right populist candidate in France. In the middle of the decade of the teens, this very far-right party called the AfD in Germany. They were interested in, they had this surge in the polls. What unifies all of those things? And what unifies them all is immigration. That became an active concern. In other words, difference. Our countries were differing. They were starting to change. And even countries that weren't changing, like Denmark, they felt like they were changing. Because there were refugees coming from the Middle East, and the EU allows for lots of free movement of people across country lines. So people in Britain started to complain a lot about the people who are Polish, who are coming and taking over their country, and of course on and on and on. So here's the thing, that didn't used to be an active concern in European politics. And so we weren't polarized. The divide used to be labor versus conservative, business versus labor, or more government programs, less government programs, just like during the New Deal. But then all of a sudden it was immigration, and it was European integration and nationalism. Of course, those are the things that nationalism at least brought about the Second and the First World War. And there was a real strong project in Europe to try to keep nationalism down. And that's, where European integration got started. And now people are like, I don't know how I feel about that. And, the refugee crisis, I think set off a set of, beliefs that were always there, but it made them really politically salient and important. And, now we are dealing with that polarization as well.
Jennifer Brimmer says, if Republicans see Democratic power and outgroup power as an existential threat to their way of life, how accurate is that? Doesn't that make it hard for them to see Democratic victory as legitimate? Yeah, Jennifer, this is just a super point. I'm going to put it a little bit differently. Instead of, Democratic, instead of existential threat, but I think that's kind of right. I'm going to just nudge this in a slightly different direction, okay? What we show in our work, I didn't go through the last of the slides, but what we've shown is that Republicans have grown to hate Democrats, but don't forget, Democrats have grown to hate Republicans too, all right? And we're able to show this, empirically over time in terms of what we call feeling thermometer scores. We ask people, how do you feel about certain groups in society? Two of them are the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And over especially the last 20 years or so, Democrats' feelings about the Republican Party and Republicans' feelings about the Democratic Party have just nosedived and just dropped off the map. We don't feel any better about our own party than we used to. It's just that we hate the other party. All right, so here's where I'm going to go with this. If you hate somebody, you guys are better than me. I do. There's actually somebody who I hate. But if you just theoretically, are you willing to believe anything about them? Yeah. Anything bad? Are you ever rooting for them to succeed? No. If they win at something, do you suspect that they cheated? Absolutely. Would you go really far to justify that belief? And this is where we are.
This is why, if Republicans see Democrats as an existential threat, and I suspect Democrats see Republicans as an existential threat, these days too. It's going to make election outcomes and everything else, really problematic. And let me just take this in a slightly different direction too, because it's not just, legitimacy and so forth. It's like, are we even pulling on the same rope anymore as a country? I'm at Carolina now. I've been here for 3 years, and boy, have I learned to hate Duke in a really short period of time. All right. I have an incredible array of baby blue jackets and pants. I mean, it's just great. It's been super for my wardrobe. All right. But if I hate Duke, it doesn't do anything to the world. All right. But if you hate the Democrats, are you rooting for them to do well when they're in office? Do you want the economy, do you want inflation to get better? Because it's just a political opportunity for you. If you're a Democrat, were you rooting for the COVID situation to improve? Not until Donald Trump was safely out of office, I bet. We'd rather not think these things about ourselves, but it's absolutely true. Are we pulling on the same rope anymore? I'm not sure that we are. It's fine if we're sports rivals, school rivals, but if we're a country, I think this is a bad spot.
Yeah. There's a comment, Jennifer, flip it. Even though Dems might see Republican power as an existential threat to their way of life, aka democracy, they do not always claim the win as not legitimate.
Yeah, and I think, Jennifer, that's true. I do think that there's, something quite different going on, as it relates to that. Now, of course, politics is different, and so forth. But when Al Gore lost under very murky circumstances to George Bush in 2000, he didn't, challenge the legitimacy of the election, past, the votes being counted in Florida. He certainly would have had stronger basis for it. Going back another 40 years before that, Richard Nixon, sounds like he was in a position where he could have, challenged ballots in at least Illinois and a couple of other states, and so forth. Why don't Democrats do that, at least in this day and age? I think it's because maybe it's hard for me to know. I think the science, the reality, may matter, a little bit more. But I think another part of it is just elite cue taking, So why did Republicans question the election result in such large numbers? Because Donald Trump did, their leader did. Let's say 2024 happens and Joe Biden loses and he challenges the election. Do you think Democrats would follow him? I think so.
And Vicki has asked another question. As climate change advances and perhaps causes a mass movement of people across borders, what might we expect? Will this division grow stronger? And also, what kind of vehicle do you drive?
Oh my gosh. I drive a Volkswagen Jetta, but I have a feeling my next car will likely be electric. But it's, but think about, like, how many Volkswagen Jettas do you see on the road? Not all that many, actually. I mean, they're kind of a niche kind of car. Of course they are, because, my worldview is fluid. It's a little niche. Like how many people with a conservative worldview do you think drive a Saab? Nobody drives this. I mean, only a lefty would drive a Saab. But anyway, so these are some of the things that is funny. Okay, so, oh my gosh. So here's the thing. I'm going to push climate change in a different direction. In the last chapter of the book, we talked about it a little bit. The more people who are, racially and ethnically different who come into the country, the more people's concerns about immigrants and others will be important, right? And, the sad fact is, do you think this is actually really interesting. On average, do you think so as the country as a whole, do you think our opinions about immigrants have improved or gotten worse over the last 2 decades? They've actually improved, okay? And that's because people on the political left have become more tolerant. People on the right haven't gotten more or less. But the concern about outsiders that people on the political right on average has always been there, always will be there. It's there's some evidence to suggest that it's human, to be concerned about people who are ethnically, racially, language-wise, in whatever way different. Okay, so let's start from that. If it's that endemic to who we are as people, then more people who are different coming in is just going to make that difference between us, worldview-wise, more important. But how about this? What if climate change does something different and it makes the South need water and the North has water, and so forth? Can you imagine a completely new political map developing out of, and who else is going to need water? The West. So now the South and the West are coalition partners. And the Great Plains and, New England all of a sudden have something in common. We got water. So, I'm not rooting for environmental catastrophe, but it might change the the disagreements, that we, have about politics. It would make them different. I think more likely the thing that will change is that, this focus, as the country becomes more diverse, the same types of political appeals are just not going to work in the same way, that they work now. And I think that will ultimately cause the change that away from this worldview dimension. But I think we probably have a couple decades to wait.
We have a comment regarding Jennifer's comment that Democrats just are more naive and are passive.
I don't know about, I definitely don't think more passive or more naive. I think this is not Democrats as a whole or Republicans as a whole. I don't mean to make a blanket statement, but I think that there is a group of, folks on the political right now for whom facts matter less than on the political left. Fox is and less Fox, more OAN and these other networks, are real opportunities for people to stew in the things that they want to continue to believe, even if they're not true. And I think that there's not a parallel thing on the political left, along those lines. But again, all that being said, I'd make a prediction, that if Joe Biden said I had Pennsylvania and Wisconsin stolen from me, North Carolina stolen from me, Democrats would believe it. Why? Because their leader told them so. So I don't want everybody to come away from this, thinking it's all them. It's not us. Plenty of us. That's, what's the old saying? It takes two to tango. It looks like Valerie Steele. I'd like to ask a question.
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
Thank you, League Women, for hostessing Hot Topics. I think the second or third one I've been to. They've all been fascinating. And thank you, Marc, for your wonderful presentation. I'm a bean counter, so I think quantification is always fascinating, how you get numbers to back all that up.
Thanks.
And that kind of segues into my thinking right now, and that is the systemic polarization in this country. I mean, we are a two-party system,
yep.
And I think that was all intentional. Things like 2 senators per state, giving the upper hand basically to the enslavers of the South, to continue that lifestyle and that accrual of wealth. The Electoral College, Citizens United, all of these are, to me, systems that are in place to maintain this kind of tension, because when the masses are frustrated and boiling and rumbling, it's easier to pick their pocket because they're worried about, eating or this or that. So I'd like, if you feel like it, for you to speak about the systems that were kind of written and stitched into the Constitution and all of our founding documents and the mindsets of the founding fathers. And, how is this affecting what's going on? I realize that multi-party countries exist. They'll have 5 or 6 major political parties. And, I don't know that they're doing all that much better than we are, but I think some of them are, and that they're able to form coalitions as a result. So the polarization is a little bit different than the polarization that exists here. Am I kind of like telling you what I'd like you to talk about, please?
Sure. Well, let me just make one comparison that I think is really useful, and I think illustrates what you're talking about. So the fact that we had exactly 2 parties used to be seen as a real virtue, for us, because what that meant was moderation would emerge. We would, the 2 major parties would have to make compromises to get all on the same page. The far left would have to compromise with the center, because if they didn't, then the right would win, right? So this was supposed to be a virtue of the 2-party system. Extremism could not find its full-throated voice like it would in a multi-party system where, say, Marine Le Pen, she doesn't have to worry about pleasing centrists because she's got her own party and so forth. Okay, so that was at least the thought. Here's the problem, that we run into, and it's, it mostly has to do with party loyalty, and how important, especially in a highly partisan time, caring so much about the party label can cause some pretty strange moves. So let's take the example of Donald Trump in 2016. So he wins the Republican nomination with a campaign that looks a lot like, frankly, Marine Le Pen in France. It's, vociferously anti-immigrant, anti-elite, using race, in ways that candidates in the past hadn't done. Okay, and how many Republicans at the beginning of the election were buying that? And in the primary were buying that? About 20%. He got, if it was Trump against one other candidate, he would have lost. But in a crowded field with 16 different candidates, all of a sudden he emerges. All right. Now, he might have been the first choice of about 20% of Republicans. But once he was the candidate, put on the red shirt, for the Republicans, then every Republican basically fell in behind him. Not everyone, but, he got about 95% support from Republicans. All right. So an extremist element within the Republican Party captured it and, became the governing, face of the party. Bernie Sanders almost did the same thing, actually, among the Democrats. He's not the mainstream of the Democratic Party, but he almost captured the party in 2016. And really, in 2020, oh my gosh, if it hadn't been, I think, for the pandemic and Trump, Sanders would have been the nominee. All right. So, and would every Democrat have gotten behind him? Yep. Okay. So let's contrast that with France. Marine Le Pen. So she's from the, National Front Party, which again is a fringe party for the most part. But she comes in second place in multi-party voting, and with like 30% of the vote or something like that. So the final two in that multi-party vote go forward and run against each other one-on-one. So Emmanuel Macron and his party run against her. So what do the other people, the other parties on the political right do? The sort of mainstream right parties, do they get behind Marine Le Pen? No. In fact, they get behind Macron. So she improves her vote share from like 30% to 35 or 40%. Whereas Trump improves his standing from 20% to 50%. So that's where our two parties really get us into trouble. If an extreme element captures it, and we hate the other party so much we can't even imagine voting for it, then we can end up with a super left or super right person who really doesn't represent the will of the people in any meaningful way.
Mark, we're going to have to take one more question. I've got another Zoom meeting at 7 o'clock. So,
well, me too. My son just came home from college today, so I got to get home after this.
Yeah. Can we make it another couple of decades?
I'm not gonna. I'm not going to be Mr. Super Depressing, in suggesting this. I'm really worried about the 2024 election. If we have another close one, whether the winner, whether the will of the people is reflected in who takes office, I think is a really active, question. And, here's the thing: how many times does that have to happen for democracy to fall apart? And my sense is one time. That's about it, because if that happens, then anything can be justified. Anything can be justified, and that's a worry. But I'm going to leave on a positive note, and that is my experience in the classroom. And my experience in the classroom, there's always this sense, I think, now I'm middle-aged. I used to be the young professor, now I'm not. And there's always this sort of sense, I think, among, those of us who are middle-aged and older, that there's something wrong with the previous or the youngest generation. And I think quite the opposite about this generation. I think these people are extraordinary. They're linked together, with each other. They're passionate. They're not always willing to be quiet and follow along and, do what they've been, told to do. And so one of the things that we might need is a new generation of leaders who are willing to do things differently. And I'm pretty bullish on this group of people, this group of kids. I worry about them some. I have two of them, one who's 17 and one who's 21. And oh my gosh, sometimes. But when I think, big about what this generation might do, I'm pretty impressed.
Well, you have been a wonderful speaker, and it's generated a lot of comment, and we greatly appreciate your time tonight. And I will count on you to sign up my book.
Anybody, I'm happy to do it for anybody. It was just such a thrill to have a book come out, that was like a real, supposed to appeal to a larger audience than, 12 academics. But anyway, you guys have been just a fantastic audience too, and I look forward to hopefully catching up with you another time.
Thank you very much.
See you now.
Good night.
Thanks, Pat. Talk to you later.
Okay. Good night, all.